The rain hadn't stopped when Officer Mark Callan forced the door open. The apartment looked as if a storm had been trapped inside. Shattered glass, overturned furniture, and a woman on the floor, blood spreading across the tiles like it was still trying to escape her body. For a moment, even a trained officer froze. But the real ache was hiding under a broken table. A small girl curled tightly, clutching a worn stuffed bunny as if it was her last breath of safety. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She only stared at Scout, Mark's old canine partner, like the dog was the only one who could understand what she had survived. Days later, in court, that same child would point to the killer, not because she found her voice, but because something warm in that aging canine made her brave enough to use it. Subscribe if you believe some heroes defend the truth without ever speaking. A cold December rain tapped against the windshield, soft but relentless, like a warning no one wanted to hear. Mark Callan stepped out of the patrol car with the slow, wary rhythm of a man who had known too many dark nights. At 40, his tall, solid frame carried a weight that went beyond duty, something carved by years beside a canine partner and the quiet grief of calls that came too late. His Navy uniform clung damp against his sun-tanned skin as he scanned the dim apartment building. Beside him, Scout moved with seasoned precision. The 8-year-old German Shepherd's black and tan coat slick with rain, ears pricked forward, breath steady. The radio still echoed the report, shouting, breaking glass, then silence. Mark felt a flicker of unease, the kind that lived in his bones more than his thoughts. The hallway smelled of old carpet and wet concrete. A single bulb flickered overhead as Mark approached the door. It stood slightly ajar, swaying in the draft. He pushed it open. The room had been torn apart, furniture overturned, glass scattered like ice across the floor. And there, near the kitchen counter, lay a woman in her early 30s, fragile and pale under the harsh ceiling light. Hannah Jensen. Her hospital-thin frame barely rose with each breath. Blonde hair matted against her cheek. Mark knelt beside her, feeling the weak pulse, a heaviness tugging at his chest. He had seen injuries like these before, born not from chaos, but from cruelty. Scout stiffened. A low growl rippled through his throat as he moved toward the dining table. He lowered his head, sniffing the shadows, then barked, sharp, urgent. Mark followed quickly, crouching down. Beneath the table, curled into a trembling ball, was a little girl, 4 years old, small but not frail, just frightened down to the marrow. Pastel clothes rumpled, blonde hair tied loosely to one side, clutching a worn stuffed bunny as if it were the last warm thing in the world. Chloe Jensen. Her wide, shaken eyes avoided the room entirely, fastening only on Scout, as if he were the one steady thing that could anchor her. Mark softened his voice, the way he rarely allowed himself to do on duty. "You're safe now, sweetheart. I'm right here." But she didn't look at him. Only at Scout, her small fingers reaching out, barely brushing the air near his fur. And in that quiet, fragile moment, Mark understood. The dog had become her lifeline, and whatever had shattered this home had left cracks far deeper than broken glass. He made a silent promise, almost a prayer carried by the rain outside, that he would not fail her. Not tonight, not ever. Morning light drifted through the blinds in thin, tired lines, touching the quiet room with a faded warmth. For 3 days, the Witness Protection Center had been a place of hushed footsteps and soft voices. Mark Callan came often, moving with the slow caution of a man who understood that some wounds were deeper than skin. His Navy K-9 uniform looked almost out of place here, among the pastel walls and children's drawings taped to the doors. Chloe Jensen sat in the far corner, her small but sturdy 4-year-old frame curled into itself, blonde hair falling over her cheek. She didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't eat more than a few bites. She only stared at the window, her worn stuffed bunny pressed tightly to her chest. A therapist, Dr. Myers, a gentle woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and patient eyes, had tried everything. Stickers, storybooks, soft questions spoken in a warm, steady voice. Nothing reached the girl. Mark watched her with a quiet ache blooming behind his ribs. Children weren't supposed to look that old inside. Scout entered with a calm, familiar rhythm, paws tapping softly on the linoleum. The 8-year-old German shepherd, with his black and tan coat and steady gaze, moved as though he sensed the heaviness in the air. Chloe's head lifted, barely at first, just a flicker of recognition, then fully, as if drawn by something deeper than memory. Mark felt it before he saw it. The shift, a stirring in the stillness. Chloe stood slow and shaky, like a deer stepping onto uncertain ground. Her soft pink sandals made a faint sound as she crossed the room. Scout didn't move away. He simply lowered his head, steady and patient. Chloe reached out, placing her small hand still trembling on his fur. The room held its breath. Dr. Myers watched, stunned. Mark felt something tighten in his throat, an old ache resurfacing, the kind tied to regrets he never spoke aloud. Then Chloe whispered, voice thin and cracked from disuse. He saw the bad man. The words were barely there, but they were real, and they broke the silence like a fragile door opening into a long, hidden room. Scout remained still, his posture protective yet gentle. Chloe leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his ear. It wasn't just comfort, it was trust, the kind that cannot be taught, only felt. Mark stepped closer, lowering himself to one knee, moving slowly so he wouldn't disrupt the fragile connection forming in front of him. Chloe didn't look at him, but she didn't pull away either. Her fingers curled deeper into Scout's fur, and for the first time since that terrible night, her breathing steadied. Mark spoke softly, careful with every word. Chloe, we're here to help you. Scout is here. I'm here. She blinked once, then again, as if pulling herself out of a long tunnel. Her lips trembled with the effort of forming another thought, but no words came. Instead, she pressed her cheek against Scout, holding on to something safe, something alive. Mark felt a tremor inside him, a mixture of hope and dread. The truth was coming, piece by piece, not through him, not through therapy, through the dog. He realized then that healing didn't always begin with answers. Sometimes it began with simply touching something that would not hurt you back. Outside, the morning light grew brighter, and Mark made a quiet promise to himself and to the child who could finally breathe. They would walk this road slowly, together. The courthouse felt colder than the morning outside, the kind of cold that settled in the walls and waited. Mark arrived early, dressed in his Navy K9 uniform shirt and charcoal tactical pants, though he felt strangely out of place among polished shoes and muted suits. Scout stayed close to him, the 8-year-old German shepherd walking with the steady discipline of a dog who had spent his entire life reading human storms. Chloe Jensen entered soon after, holding her worn stuffed bunny in one hand and clutching Scout's thick fur with the other. Her blonde hair was tied to one side, uneven and soft around her small, fair face. Mark watched her carefully, the way a father might watch a child he wished he could protect from the world's cruelties. She didn't speak. She didn't look up. But she walked, slowly, bravely, guided by the quiet presence of the dog beside her. In courtrooms, Mark had learned, silence was often louder than testimony, and Chloe carried a kind of silence that made grown men uneasy. Lauren Page entered with a firm stride, her charcoal gray suit sharp against the wooden backdrop of the chamber. She was a woman of 36, with tied-back brown hair and the poised, steady voice of someone accustomed to standing her ground before skeptical judges. Today, though, her voice carried something gentler. She knelt beside Chloe, speaking so softly even Mark could barely hear. "You're safe," she whispered. "Scout will be right here." Chloe gave no sign she had heard, but her fingers tightened in the dog's fur. Then the heavy doors opened, and the room grew still as Lucas Denton was led to the defendant's table. He appeared in his mid-30s, unshaven, wearing a wrinkled county-issue shirt, eyes darting, restless, the gaze of a man who expected the world to bend around him. Mark felt something in Scout's posture shift. The dog stood slightly taller, ears angled forward, breath controlled. He remembered that stance from countless scenes: recognition, unease, readiness. When Chloe was called to the stand, an audible hesitation swept through the courtroom. People leaned forward, others held back their breath as if afraid to disturb the moment. Mark walked her to the small witness seat, Scout settling at her feet, protective and calm. Chloe's small but steady frame looked fragile under the high wooden panels. She lowered her head and leaned down, whispering into Scout's ear, a whisper so faint it seemed made of breath rather than sound. Then she looked up, and for the first time since the incident, she held someone's gaze. Her small hand lifted, trembling but determined, pointing toward Lucas. "He's the bad one." The words were soft, but they rippled through the courtroom like a crack splitting frozen ground. A collective gasp rose. Lauren closed her eyes for a brief second. A quiet exhale of relief and grief mingled. Mark felt an ache spread through his chest, some mixture of pride, sorrow, and the harsh truth that a child should never have to carry this kind of courage. Scout remained still, watching Chloe the way only a dog can, with an unwavering belief that goodness can still rise in broken places. As the judge called for order, Mark gently placed a hand on Chloe's back, offering strength without pressure. "Good job," he whispered. "You're not alone now." And for the first time, Chloe's shoulders eased. Rain tapped gently against the courthouse windows, a soft percussion that made the silence inside feel heavier. Lauren Page stood near the small table where Chloe sat, her charcoal gray suit blending with the muted colors of the room. She carried herself with a calm certainty, but her eyes, focused and kind, held a quiet ache. She handed Chloe a box of colored pencils, sliding them across the polished wood with a slow, careful motion. Chloe, with her small but healthy 4-year-old frame and blonde hair fallen around her cheek, looked down at the colors with a kind of distant curiosity. Mark watched from a few steps away, arms folded loosely, boots planted firm on the floor. He felt the weight in the air, the sort that pressed behind the ribs. Scout lay at his feet, the seasoned 8-year-old German shepherd resting calm but alert, thick black and tan fur rising slightly with each careful breath. Lauren spoke softly. "Draw whatever you remember, sweetheart." The crayons clicked gently as Chloe picked them up, hands trembling just enough to break Mark's heart. And then, slowly, she began to draw. The picture came alive in quiet strokes. A broken table, legs bent, top cracked. A woman's form, faint lines showing a fall. A looming figure with an arm raised. And in the corner, a small square of shadow where a child had hidden. Chloe's breaths grew shallow as she colored in the darkness. Scout shifted, lifting his head and placing it on Chloe's lap, his warm weight grounding her. The courtroom lights felt too bright, too clean for the pain being pulled from memory. When Chloe stopped drawing, her fingers loosened around the crayon as if the effort had drained something deep inside her. She leaned into Scout, her cheek brushing his fur. No words were spoken, but the room felt full, crowded by the quiet honesty of a child's truth. The judge, a man in his late 60s with thinning gray hair and tired eyes, watched with an unusual stillness. Even he understood the fragility of the moment. Lauren lifted the drawing with both hands, her voice low and steady. "Your Honor," she said, "the truth of a child is simple. They don't fabricate, they feel, they remember with their hearts, not with agendas." Mark felt Scout's body tense at his side, as though the dog sensed every tremor of Chloe's fear. The drawing was placed gently on the projector. Colors bloomed across the courtroom wall, soft, uneven, heartbreakingly sincere. No one moved. The jurors stared, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something heavier. Chloe, still leaning against Scout, closed her eyes for a long moment. Lauren stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying more weight than any legal argument could. "This isn't evidence," she said. "It's pain made visible." Mark looked at Chloe then, really looked, at her small shoulders, her shaking breath, the courage required just to put colors on paper. In that moment, he felt something anchor inside him. A promise. A quiet vow. That this child would never again face the world alone. A cold wind rattled the narrow windows of the evidence room, shaking loose a faint hum from the fluorescent lights. Mark Callan stood quietly near the steel counter, arms crossed, his Navy K-9 uniform carrying the faint scent of rain and dog fur. The technician beside him, a man in his 30s with tired eyes and a stubble-shadowed jaw, adjusted the audio filters with slow care. His name was Dan Foster, soft-spoken, thinning brown hair, a faded plaid shirt stretched across his shoulders. He wasn't a detective, just a patient man who spent long nights fixing broken sound, someone who believed that machines could help tell human truths. Mark felt the weight of waiting, the kind that pressed between the ribs. Scout sat nearby, his 8-year-old black and tan coat calm beneath the pale light, ears twitching at every noise, his chest rising with steady, patient breaths. Dan raised the volume. Static crackled. Then came the chaos. Footsteps stumbling, wood cracking, the scrape of a table being overturned. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, almost seeing the room again. The shattered glass, the blood, the fear. And then a small voice broke through the noise, trembling, barely air. "Scout, hide." The sound was fragile, as if pulled from the edge of memory. Mark's jaw tightened. Dan looked up, face pale. "That's the girl?" he whispered. Mark nodded slowly. Chloe's voice, faint but certain, echoed in the narrow room. It matched the trembling whisper she'd spoken to Scout in court. That night, she had not called for her mother. She had not screamed for help. Her instinct was to protect the dog who protected her. Mark felt that settle in him like a warm ache. The technician printed the audio waveform, hands shaky but precise. The sound had become ink, a shape, proof carved into silence. At the courthouse, as the recording played, the room stood breathless, jurors leaning in, lawyers frozen, the judge's lined face growing stiff with recognition. Lucas Denton, sitting at the defendant's table, went pale beneath the dull lights. The sound no longer belonged to him. It belonged to truth. Lauren Page leaned slightly toward Mark, her charcoal gray sleeve brushing his arm. Her voice was soft enough to not disturb the room. "She remembers everything," she murmured, but through Scout. Mark looked down at the German shepherd lying at his feet, calm, alert, the steady guardian of a child who should never have learned to fear. Scout lifted his head and met Mark's gaze. There was no language there, only a quiet understanding, shared by beings who witness pain and carry it without complaint. Mark knelt beside the dog, placing a hand gently on his fur. The coat was warm, alive, real. He whispered so softly even Lauren couldn't fully hear, "You did good." Scout held still, as if the words mattered. Mark felt it then, not victory, not triumph, just a deeper duty, one he hadn't known he'd needed to fulfill. To protect those who speak the truth without using words. Evening crept across the city in slow amber strides, staining the courthouse steps with fading light. Mark Callan stood beside the tall columns, the air thick with diesel fumes and the chill of December, reports tucked beneath his arm. He waited while Lauren Page walked toward him, her charcoal suit catching the last glow of dusk. She read his face before he spoke. Years of witnessing broken stories had sharpened her intuition. She knew the look of a man holding something dangerous. Mark showed her a printout, transaction logs traced to Frank Adler, the heavy-set corporate director with a navy shirt and weary posture. The money was funneled quietly, not into Lucas Denton's account, but to the firm of Raymond Cole, the defense attorney who carried himself with smooth black and gray hair and an almost excessively polished demeanor. Lauren's jaw tightened, a flicker of disbelief brushing across her features. "This wasn't just a crime of rage," she murmured. "It was planned, paid for." Mark nodded slowly, feeling the truth sink like cold water through fabric. Denton wasn't the monster. He was the hired shadow, and Cole was the man who washed away blood with paperwork. They walked inside to retrieve additional records. The corridors smelled of old wood and metal polish, their footsteps echoing like memories. Scout padded silently beside them, the 8-year-old German shepherd moving with alert patience, his thick black and tan coat brushing Mark's boot every few steps. While Lauren reviewed documents with tight concentration, Mark sat with Scout near an evidence locker, running his hand through warm fur. His thoughts tangled with old guilt, cases where justice had come too late, victims whose truths never surfaced. Perhaps this time, something could be saved before it broke completely. Outside the building, a pale gray sedan idled too long at the curb. Its tinted windows watched more than they reflected. Mark sensed the watchful stillness, a predator's posture in machinery. When he stepped outside, Scout stiffened, ears pricked, a low growl curling beneath his breath. The sedan pulled out slowly, following at a measured distance. Someone wasn't waiting for the trial to end. Someone feared what Mark might bring into the light. He tightened his grip on the folder of evidence, a cold sweat forming beneath his collar. Halfway down the street, Mark paused beneath a flickering street lamp. The light buzzed, casting Scout's shadow long and sharp against the pavement. He crouched, resting a steady hand on the dog's neck. Scout met his gaze with quiet intensity, the kind carried by a creature who had seen injury without resentment, loyalty without question. Mark spoke softly, more to the air than to the risk ahead. "If I don't come back, you protect her. You protect Chloe." Scout didn't bark or move. He simply held the moment, eyes steady, posture rigid like a vow forged without language. Mark breathed once, slow and deep. Duty was never loud. Sometimes it was a quiet choice made in the dark. He stood, turning toward the waiting headlights, and Scout walked with him, step for unwavering step. The sun had barely lifted when the courthouse filled with nervous footsteps and restless murmurs. Mark Callan sat near the front, his Navy K-9 uniform neat but worn from long days, without proper rest. Scout lay at his side, the 8-year-old German shepherd breathing slow and steady, though his ears remained alert. Chloe entered quietly with Lauren Page walking beside her, the little girl in pastel clothing, holding a fresh drawn in her small hands. She seemed stronger than before, not louder, not braver in the way adults imagine bravery, but steadier, as though simply enduring had made her older than 4. Mark watched her take her seat with her worn stuffed bunny on her lap, and he felt the familiar ache of wishing the world were gentler. Lauren unfolded the drawing and held it up to the courtroom. The image was simple. 2 men, one with a red tie, one with dark, restless features resembling Denton. The red tie stood out like a wound. It pointed unmistakably to Raymond Cole. The defense attorney sat rigid in his glossy black suit, his black and gray hair immaculately combed as though appearance could defend him. His face tightened, but he forced a calm, measured breath, like a man accustomed to slipping out from under guilt through clever words. The evidence presented followed a different rhythm. ATM records confirming his presence near the apartment that night. Cell tower data tracing his phone to the same street where Hannah Jensen fell bleeding to the floor. And, beneath it all, a money trail stained with intent. The courtroom turned cold, as though every breath paused to consider the weight of truth. Cole tried to speak, his voice cracking through practiced confidence. "She's lying," he said, pointing at a child clinging to a stuffed bunny. His pale hands trembled, fingers curling around a pen he could no longer control. Mark rose, slow and grounded, his boots pressing firmly into the wooden floor. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't glare. He simply spoke with a quiet finality that landed deeper than shouting ever could. "No," he said, "he's the one lying, and Scout knows it." For a moment, no one moved. Then Scout stood, not commanded, not cued by training. He turned toward Cole and barked with a force that echoed beyond obedience. It was instinct, recognition, a raw response to something hidden beneath words. Cole's posture shattered, his shoulders collapsing inward. His eyes darted, then sank as though the weight of being seen, truly seen, was too heavy to bear. And slowly, he confessed. Hired by Frank Adler. Paid to silence Hannah before she exposed fraudulent drugs harming patients. Denton was merely the arm. Cole was the hand guiding it. Adler was the shadow above them all. Chloe didn't cheer or cry. She simply leaned down and rested her face against Scout's neck, as if thanking him without words. Mark exhaled softly. Justice didn't roar. Sometimes it arrived in quiet truth, revealed by those who could not speak for themselves. And in that silence, something in him finally let go. Spring sunlight drifted through the hospital windows, warm and slow like a breath finally released. The hallways smelled of clean linens and faint disinfectant, the quiet kind that softened footsteps and voices alike. Mark Callan stood silently near the doorway, his Navy K-9 uniform crisp, yet carrying small creases from long days of worry. Scout lay beside him, the 8-year-old German shepherd resting with a patience that seemed older than his years, thick black and tan fur rising and falling with steady breath. Down the corridor, Chloe sat cross-legged on the floor, tiny foam sandals peeking beneath her pastel clothing. She held crayons, drawing small shapes on scrap paper, while Scout watched over her like a gentle sentinel. And then the sound came, soft, broken, full of life trying to return. Hannah Jensen was awake. She was thinner, pale beneath her hospital gown, but her eyes, tired and trembling, found her child. She tried to sit up and failed, then tried again, and succeeded only because love demanded she rise. Chloe saw her mother and froze, as though afraid the moment might disappear if she moved. Then she ran, tiny feet pounding across the hall, pastel colors a blur. Hannah opened her arms and gathered her small daughter against her chest, shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than pain. "You saved me," she whispered into Chloe's hair, the words cracked but full. "My little angel, you saved me." Chloe didn't answer, only pressed her face into her mother's hospital gown and held tight. Scout watched from a few feet away, ears lifted, body still, recognizing reunion like a memory he had carried for her. Mark stayed at the door, not wanting to disturb the fragile miracle unfolding. But Lauren Page arrived, her charcoal gray suit still sharp, yet her eyes softer than any courtroom moment. She stood next to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Not formal, not congratulatory, simply human. "You helped too," she said quietly. "And that dog." Her voice trailed off, but the sentiment lingered. A few days later, the small town gathered for a recognition ceremony at the community hall. Wood panels lined the walls, sunlight reflecting softly off old plaques and polished floors. Chloe stood at the front, clutching a handmade badge cut from paper, scribbled with crayons. With shy steps, she crossed the stage toward Scout. The hall fell silent. She placed the badge on his chest, where a vest might have been, and in large, uneven letters it read, "Scout, my hero." The audience rose to their feet, applause echoing through the wooden chamber like rain on rooftops. Scout tilted his head, as though puzzled by the praise, but Chloe wrapped both arms around his neck, and that was explanation enough. Mark crouched beside them, his hand gently resting on the dog's back. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sunlight streamed through high windows, dust motes glowing like small blessings drifting down. Chloe smiled through fading tears. Scout gave a soft, contented bark, low and warm. And Mark understood. Some cases aren't solved with evidence alone. They're healed with heart. When justice feels heavy and voices tremble in fear, remember this. Truth can still emerge from the quiet, from a child who whispers, from an old K9 who simply stands by her side. You do not need a loud voice to protect someone, only loyalty and compassion, strong enough to say, "I'm here with you." If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs courage today. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to join our family of listeners. May God bless you with peace, strength, and healing in every day that remains.